Right, hello everybody and welcome to what is our first series of Caribbean seminars of this upcoming semester. We've got a really fantastic selection of speakers coming to you in February, March and April. Also to say that this space is intended to foster and facilitate research in all of its forms. So we're particularly encouraged to and excited to welcome a couple of PhD students who will be joining us this semester. But without further ado, let me first introduce you and welcome Trey Ventour-Griffiths, who is an autistic creative, public historian, sociologist and cultural critic who speaks and writes on subjects broadly contained within Black British history, neurodiversity, intersectionality, cultural criticism and insurgent politics. So he's currently writing a creative PhD and his research is on UK Northern Caribbean communities from 1985 until 1948, sorry, until 1985. And he's also published extensively and written for Policy Press, for Penguin Random House, and others. And he's written on Peaky Blinders, Downton Abbey, British horror, and more, while also contributing to his local community. So over to you, Trey. Best of luck.
So, afternoon, everyone. So today's session is really exploring one story of my wider PhD. I know that what you hear today is by far an incomplete, since it's an interpretation of a small sample of interviews within my broader interview sample, which was actually approximately 120 interviews I did between April last year and December 2023. Since writing the summary for this event, I made amendments to the timeline for this talk after wider research. So it's actually 1973 to 1995, which takes us beyond the scope of my thesis, which actually ends in 1985. So for those of you watching this internationally, Northampton is a town in Northamptonshire, a county in the Midlands within the country of England, about an hour from London to the south and an hour from Birmingham to the north, largely drawn from interviews with those who came here from the Caribbean as children in the 50s and 60s, those born here to Caribbean parents in that same era, and also their English friends as well. This paper discusses Northampton's Matta Fancanta youth movement as an addition to city narratives of Black activism within the UK. Just to reiterate what Eve said, my name is Trey Ventour-Griffiths, and I'm a UK Northampton-based creative and scholar whose work can be broadly contained within Black history, neurodiversity, the arts, cultural criticism, and insurgent politics. For context, my PhD is a creative writing PhD, not a history one. My working title is Northamptonshire is the place for me, taking this song from the 1950s, creative responses to Provincial England, Caribbean Diaspora, 1948 to 85. I'm using all history testimonies, so I did approximately 120 interviews last year across the Caribbean elders who came here as adults, but also their children who came here as children, and also first generation Caribbean British people born and raised in Northamptonshire or came here from elsewhere as adults, but previously from Caribbean backgrounds, and also taking perspectives of other people who had extensive engagements with Northampton Black communities as well. And that will be mixed in with limited secondary sources like history books and other sources like news media from the time to produce a creative non-fiction piece. So true stories with a literary flair as well. Generally, in this lecture and my wider PhD, I'm using interviews to help tell a wider story of Caribbean Northamptonshire. And what you hear this afternoon will be what some of what my participants have told me of their experiences, but streamlined into a more storytelling element. So not always using direct quotations, but using a more storytelling format to fill in the gaps of what is unsaid. As I was told by one academic friend, you're not simply managing data anymore, you are developing a perspective about it. There are over 80 members of Matta Fancanta and probably hundreds more, if not thousands, who attended events. And this lecture is based on a tiny fraction. I've also supplemented this with some wider reading materials as well. Amid what has been termed as Black British activism, as well, popular activist stories in the UK remain city-centric, whether we are talking about the backstory to Notting Hill Carnival in London, or the 1963 Bristol bus boycott, or even the opening of Handsworth Cultural Centre in 1970 at Birmingham, or even the underlying reasons for uprisings against police in many English cities in the 70s and 80s. But my PhD is also auto-ethnographic. So ethnography is the study of culture, and auto being focusing on the self. So auto-ethnography is basically using personal experiences to talk about the wider cultural experiences. So my mum's family in large came from the parish of St. John in Grenada. Specifically, my maternal great-grandparents, Toyley and Edson Noel, were in Northampton by 1962. My grandfather is one of 11, and his brother Albert came to England in 55. Remarked upon by my grandfather and their sister, Auntie Kay, as the same year as Hurricane Janet. Auntie Rosie, their sister, was in Northampton from the early 60s and also worked as an auxiliary nurse within the NHS as well. And their sisters, Auntie Betts and Auntie Kay, settled in London. Uncle Albert, Auntie Betts, Auntie Kay, Auntie Rosie, and my grandfather, Sarge, came from a family whose background was in farming, and everything they ate came from the land. And back in the village, everybody knew each other. So when they got here, Grenadians in Northampton found each other as they did in London. So for many families that came from rural areas of the Caribbean and settled in big cities must have been disorientating at least, which may have made towns like Northampton and Wellingborough appealing. In focusing on the cities, then I think there was a forgotten heritage of those early Caribbean arrivals at risk of being lost. So my PhD is also auto-ethnographic, taking those personal family histories as well to make sense of the wider narrative. But my family, having been in Northampton since the early 60s, I'm the fourth generation, me and my brother and I, to grown up in the town. So I plot this lecture from Northants as home and personal, and Tallawah, meaning small but mighty or sturdy, and Matta Fancanta embodies that. Here I do focus on the experiences of Black men and their lives, though I'm well aware Black women had their own experiences in the very male-dominated space of Leicester in the 70s and 80s England. These young men who led that organisation were Caribbean by birth and descent, and Matta Fancanta, known locally as Movement, defined many of that generation, not only through the roots reggae culture, but also through sports teams and professional development opportunities. And this talk really discusses both general and very specific, which you'll see. Primarily, MFM was an alternative to local youth provisions, catering to the specific cultural needs of Caribbean youths in Northampton, but it did have wider appeal. First coined in the 70s, the term Matta Fancanta comes from the Wolof and Amharic languages to mean come guard or save yourself from self-destruction, meaning save yourself, preserve yourself from the outside forces, Babylon, like the police and racist employers. As many members were also Rastafarian, this also made many of them fluent in the cultural language of Rastafari, which talked about institutions like the police, and really this institution of whiteness as Babylon and Africa as Zion. The return to Africa for many members was something that was always considered, as Lee Bryant had already gone and come back, which I'll talk about in just a second. For people like Trevor Hall, now known as Ras Jabulani, who I interviewed, as well as Lee, and also Ira Movin, notions of Africa echoed Marcus Garvey and was like a homecoming. Uncle Ira, as I know him, told me on going to Ghana, he was told, welcome home. He came to Northampton as a child from Nevis in 1970, and Trevor now lives in Zimbabwe. Matta Fancanta's origin story speaks to that, making it also stigmatized by many church-going Caribbean elders too. Many of them now recognizable media imagery of Black people stepping off ships and BOAC planes dressed in suits and nice dresses. The story of Matta Fancanta is important, not only as part of my local history, but also part of the wider Midlands, broader English and British history and histories of the Caribbean, since so much Caribbean history happened in the diaspora. Dominant focuses on London and other big cities have eclipsed other English sites of Caribbean settlement like Bedford, Huddersfield, Basingstoke, Doncaster, Rugby, Leicester, Derby, and also Edinburgh, places mentioned in my interviews with elders. The exclusion of Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland also refocuses large English cities as the centre. Small/big towns, minor cities, the coast, and what literary critic Corinne Fowler calls the green and pleasant land of the country remains an enigma in representations of Caribbean people in post-war England, Scotland, and Ireland. Places like Northampton and Wellingborough in England were such sites. For example, when my great-grandparents first arrived in Northampton in 1962, they were not alone. Between 1948 and 1970, many arrived here from islands like Barbados, St. Kitts and Nevis, Montserrat, Jamaica, Grenada, St. Vincent, and Trinidad, seeking work, following family, and pursuing more affordable housing than what was offered in the big cities. Before long, there was a Black Caribbean community in Northampton and Wellingborough, where everybody knew each other. In Kettering as well, there were some families from the 60s, further to a presence in villages like Isham from the 1970s, and also Beaujeu from 1980, which is just outside of Wellingborough as well. Matta Fancanta is about the children of that earlier generation. It's a story of Black Caribbean young people doing it for themselves in what was a relatively provincial area. Here we might think of films and TV as another site of where Black historical narratives are produced. Screen media texts over the past 50 years have influenced perceptions, from things like Horace Obe's 1976 film Pressure, through to Babylon in 1980, Burning an Illusion, 1981, Hands with Songs in the mid-80s as well, Young Soul Rebels in the 90s, and also things like Desmond's, The Real McCoy, and also most recently things like Rye Lane and Dreaming Whilst Black that have centralized English cities. Likewise, stories of the Indo-Caribbean and Chinese Caribbean transatlantic crossings have willfully been ignored. Black experiences of post-war Brixton and Notting Hill largely have become the knowledge centre that media tell swathes of the historical post-war Caribbean narrative. So England, but very much London, and also maybe post-port cities like Bristol and Liverpool have become the place where, I guess, certain elements of Black Britishness are legitimised. Matta Fancanta challenges that city knowledge through provincial Northants, and brings us into the picture as another site of Black experiences, also one whose existence came from the African continent, pertinently the Gambia. The dominant mainstream has introduced us to characters like Claudia Jones and Darcus Howe in the London context. But what about provincial Black communities? Though I'm not always in favour of biographizing Black British history, I have done so a bit in this paper to show what other characters there were. However, if you do want to see what I actually think about biographization of Black history and also the problems with Black excellence discourse, I did write a paper for Base Reflections called The House of Black Excellence, Monument Culture, and the Spectacularized Black British Past, which is available online. In 1974 to 75, a group of Black men drove from Knightsbridge in London to the Gambia on the African continent. One of these men was Lee Bryant. He came to London as a child from Jamaica in 1959, moving to Northampton in the early 70s as a young adult. In the Gambia, he was inspired by young people on a beach. And I say young because none of them were older than 18, but were running a youth centre. His experiences changed his perceptions of what responsibility looks like If these children can run a centre, why couldn't black youngsters do it in Northampton? This is in part what led to MFM, including the many conversations in people's houses. For example, on his return, Lee's house on Lumber Tubs, pictured here, so the Lumber Tubs area of Northampton, and then Palmerston Road, which is nearer to town, was filled with people for weeks wanting to know about Africa. It was then suggested by a black American guy called Julian, reportedly, that they could squat a place. In those days, Lee was a Rastafarian, and his trip to the Gambia was life-changing. Similarly, Trevor Hall, now known as Ras Jubilani, who came to Northampton as a child from Gloucester, which also had its own Caribbean community in the 60s, and also Duku, who came from Jamaica as a child, all now living in different parts of the African continent. As Stuart Hall has also argued that Rastafarianism necessitated an adapting of blackness via a rediscovery of Africa. But let's also talk about what else was happening in Northampton around that time. On the 25th of June, 1972, a young Bob Marley played as a warm-up act for Johnny Nash at a club on Bridge Street called Shades. A 1973 concert on the 22nd of May at King's Heath's Fantasia Club also brought Bob Marley back to Northampton with the Wailers, reportedly one of their first gigs in England outside of a major city. On the 30th of November 1973, they played again at Nen College on St George's Avenue, which later became known as the University of Northampton. The latter gigs were part of the Catch a Fire tour and would have been many local people's first exposure to Rastafarianism and Bob Marley's iconic aesthetic. Songs like Slave Driver and 400 Years emphasised Africanness and the diaspora consciousness, and the album might have been a first for marketing of that kind, making Rasta popular. When I interviewed a guy called Andy Savage, a white guy that came to Northampton from Burton-on-Trent in 1970, I sensed that this was a first even for him, coming from a place where there was already a strong Caribbean community that he had been exposed to already and was part of. He wasn't a stranger to the Caribbean culture, but Bob Marley was another force entirely. By 1970, a young Trevor Hall was 13 and a selector DJ in Northampton. His uncle was the famous Count Shelley, who owned Third World Records and London's Count Shelley Sound. Trevor later bought out that sound in 73. So that time you had sounds like Count Shelley, Jar Shaka, Coxsone, Fatman, Duke Reid, Quaker City, Black Infinity, Sovereign, and others. Big Youth album Screaming Target dropped in 72. And there were other local sounds. I was told about Jar Shalis in Wellingborough, and also later on, Sisters of Love in Northampton, run by local black women. Jar also played on one of his early gigs at Steps Youth Club on Kingswell Street in Northampton. Locally, this was a great time for youth culture where anti-oppression work was championed by teenagers and young adults through the music. Amid all of that, you had the latest pre-release 45 singles from Jamaica, which could be found in a record shop called Spinadisc. Sound system in Northampton defined a generation that did a lot to reduce racial barriers, and some cases have re-emerged back today. Reggae also joined hands with the punk movement, and local black venue Matta Fancanta did hire out its space to punks, who like many of the Caribbean youth at MFM, were anti-system. Like those at Movement, punk offered alternative ways of life to mainstream rules and norms, opposing mainstream ideologies, authority, consumerism, and corporations, inspiring the freedom to act and think how you like outside of the system. The time MFM and national punk movement existed was also punctuated by a global recession and high levels of unemployment. By 1977, the punk scene in England embraced roots reggae, much to the surprise of Michael Riley, who was in Birmingham reggae band Steel Pulse. Now an academic in Black British music, in the documentary Roots Reggae Rebellion, which was presented by Akala in 2016, he recollects how many of these white punks actually understood what roots reggae was talking about, including disenfranchisement from the system. In the music, at least, young people were leading the way, and locally this also manifested in local youth clubs. On Clare Street, there was Persuaders Youth Club run by Leo Walker, Joyce Eubanks, and Beverly Chisholm. It was Caribbean run, and most of the kids that went there were of Caribbean background as well. Likewise, as I said already, Kingswell Street, there was Steps, run by a white guy called Tom. While I cannot be specific yet on years, Tom establishing Steps did allow Black youth somewhere to go. Persuaders Youth Club latter folded due to lack of community engagement from parents, and Steps also folded, and most of the young people that went to Steps were also Black, and also it was the white friends of Black people as well. And many of those Black and white kids then transitioned to MFM. In 1973, a younger and motivated Sarah Berry came to Northampton to take up a job as Assistant Community Relations Officer with what was then called Northampton Council for Community Relations, and was joined by the Jamaican-born Pascal Plummer in '74, who came down from Wolverhampton to take up that job as well. In 1965, the newly prior introduced Race Relations Act, which on paper criminalised racism in public spaces, led to the formation of a Community Race Council Board. And this board greenlit funding to construct many community relations councils, so CRCs, across England, such as in Northampton and Wellingborough. Mike Prescott later came to Wellingborough, I think it was in '76, to take a job as the race, I guess what we call now like an anti-racism officer within that organisation. With characters like Ivan Bryan as well, and also school teacher at that time, Marcia Walker, both from Jamaica, they and Sarah also conducted surveys about Black aspirations in schools, interviewing many Black students. This survey led to the formation of the West Indian Parents Association in '74. A 1977 article from the Northampton Chronicle and Echo quotes Sarah, then a CRC officer, saying that MFM are members of the Community Relations Council, and they approached us some months ago for assistance in obtaining premises. We subsequently talked to local authority for information in general, and also specific information about the Salvation Army building, but were informed that no suitable premises were available. I'm sure that everyone in the community welcomes constructive efforts by this group of young people to take responsibility, steps to help themselves, said Sarah Berry in an article published in '77. This article continues to discuss how Sarah supported them, but also the fact that some others in the local community did too, at least vocally, including youth leader Reverend Harry Whitaker, leader of Northamptonshire Association of Youth Clubs. Marcia was also involved in the West Indian Parents Association and was a founding member. I expect many of the early kids that went to Whipper eventually went to MFM years later. West Indian Parents Association were responding to the subnormal scandal of the late '60s and early '70s of state violence in education. Many of the children, so-called acting out and being non-compliant, were educationally further ahead than what they were being taught. Personally, as Sarah told me, in terms of many of the kids from Barbados, bored and unstimulated, they acted out. However, able Black children were also being put into so-called, what was described to me in a '70s context, back then they called them remedial units, like at Weaver's School in Wellingborough and Billingbrook in Northampton, where the logic of subnormal was imposed on many able children, making the West Indian Parents Association a public necessity. This organisation was founded in '74, and early founders included Marcia Walker, Joe Dixon, Ivan Bryan, and others. Early activities included a Saturday school that started at Barry Road Primary. Sarah Berry came up with the idea for schools to refer children to the West Indian Parents Association, children that the schools thought were unable to learn properly, etc., etc. And Whipper proved them wrong. Some of these children were sent to the multicultural service to learn English as a second language, problematically, and IQ tests not fit for most children, including white children, let alone Black children newly arrived from the Caribbean. Anyway, in the wake of this, in '77, Black Caribbean youngsters conducted a 48-day squat of the old Salvation Army Citadel on Sheep Street in the town centre. People like Lee Bryan, Trevor Hall, Pedro Samuel, Ira Moven, Psyche, Job, and others were part of the original squatters crew. Job used to sleep there overnight while undercover police disguised as homeless people tried to coax him out. What became known as movement, or MFM, was a self-managed space for youth activities and professional development, an alternative to local authority youth provisions. 48 days, they fended off the police, as well as the stigma somewhat from their own community, elders who thought such behaviours were unrespectable. The 70s and 80s was a time of anti-police fever across many of England's black communities, like in Birmingham, London, Manchester, Liverpool, Bristol. Northampton had never had such uprisings, but that ill feeling was there because for many of the guys at movement, police harassment was a way of life. And in the 70s as well, meant we had numbers of estates locally built to house what they described as so-called London overspill as well. So quite a lot of folks from London had moved up to live here. When I talked to Pedro, who came to Northampton from St. Kitts as a child during the 60s, he described how his parents would blame him for bringing police to their door, not realising that some police were just racist and disliked black people. It took some of the elders a bit longer to realise the police would make things up to pin on black youth. Not all police were to be reasoned with. For years during the 70s, many young black people would walk in pairs for safety, both from police and fascist skinheads. The introduction of sus laws in the 80s, I was told, simply greenlit what police were already doing with an official stamp. I was told it made it legal to harass black people who were criminalised for being black. People were being arrested and in prison time for crimes they did not do. From the get-go, MFM's ethos of self-help did make them a target. The strange thing is that after the headlines like Black Squatters Occupy Citadel, like this one here, the establishment stopped threatening movement and gave them some money in the form of grants for rents and rates, classes in electronics and reprographic printing. Herbert Mackenzie, who had trained in printing, I was told at the local newspaper, the Chronicle and Echo, ran the printing press. The West Indian Parent Association used to get their brochures printed at MFM, and some of my participants also remember disgruntled elders raising eyebrows and screwing up their face at the mere mention of MFM, mainly, I believe, due to stigma carried over from the Caribbean against Rastafarians. Electronics was run by an Englishman called Phil, who taught electronics there for years, and these professional development opportunities allowed young people to upskill themselves, many of whom had already been failed by schools in Northampton as well. With many MFM members being Rastafarian, they faced discrimination in employment and also from their parents' generation. In his essay, Negotiating Caribbean Identities, Stuart Hall writes that Rastafarianism saved the second generation of young black people in British society. Likewise, how Kieran Connell describes in Black Handsworth, Matta Fancanta in Northampton's context was also about freedom from oppression and resonated with many black people who had either been born and or schooled in Britain. And for those who came from Jamaica, specifically Jamaica as adults, they would have seen the Rasta movement firsthand, where the authorities identified Rastafarianism effectively as a cult of criminality involved in the use of cannabis and apparently bordering on madness. 1930s Jamaica saw Rastas arrested for selling pictures of Haile Selassie, or during the 60s, simply being a Rasta was seen as a criminal offence. In the 2016 documentary, Roots, Reggae and Rebellion, historian Carolyn Cooper further tells us, you take human beings and try to turn them into objects, people resist. Jamaica is one of the countries in the Caribbean that had the most slave rebellions, so it was a constant fight. Well, Rastafari became, in the early 20th century, a manifestation of this spirit of resistance. So the founding of Matta Fancanta by these young Rastas in the 70s was viewed as antagonistic to the local establishment, at the beginning largely the police and the local authority, further to maybe to black organisations led by people who came here in the 50s and 60s as adults. These would have been children of the 30s and may have had those prejudices imposed on them from the wider society as well. From a Muslim positionality, UK Bradford poet and educator Surmaya Manzoor Khan writes about this sort of thing in a contemporary context, where the whole idea of respectability politics is something that we're still dealing with today in different forms. The ability to be yourself with no questions asked. Soyamaya Manzor Khan's work, poetry, broadly speaking, I think does very well in speaking to that idea. So I definitely recommend everyone checking out what she writes about this too. Movement existed in a time where white supremacy pervaded mainstream employment and education that stilted black progression. This organisation was a form of activism that inspired others, including Punjabi youths in Leicester that went on to squat the boys' school in the early 80s as an alternative to local authority youth services and Asian organisations based around religion and dominated by older men. Likewise, I was told about an elder called John who came to MFM from Oxford, asking for help in doing the same thing over there. Movement was freedom from oppression, as many of their elder parents had arrived in England with colonial mindsets. Personally, the behaviours of many of the more conservative church-going Christian Caribbean people were anti-MFM. In Movement's ethos of self-help, in many ways they were alone. Little help from their parents' generation, if any, and no help from many of the more conservative white organisations. They really did do it for themselves and were working on a blank canvas and are a good example of showing how in cases our elders are not always in their positions to help us. They themselves victims of the same colonising discourse that we're still fighting today. The introduction of the West Indian social clubs were made in the face of racism and were in themselves an activist against the colour bars that existed in mainstream white clubs in Northampton and elsewhere. But they were not made for young people in mind. Young people used them, but it wasn't a place they could call their own. But many of their parents did pioneer the West Indian clubs, and Northampton's was one of the first in this country, I believe, from at least 1963, United Social Club. I was told that United Social was MFM's rival as well. For some of my participants who came here as children, their parents arrived in England with colonial mindsets. I will reiterate that. It warrants questioning if the decisions of the elder, so described Windrush generation to integrate themselves in British colonial systems like the courts, like policing, like local politics, is a result of that. To many of that generation of young people, their parents who ran the West Indian clubs were not community leaders. In fact, young people thought MFM were more in tune with the youth. Many elders harboured prejudices against Rasta and thus Matta Fancanta. With prejudice from elders on one side and society on the other, these young people looked at themselves. In the late 70s, movement arrived in response to the violent surveillance of security in the newly built shopping complex, the Grosvenor Centre, that did not like black kids hanging out there. From the early 80s, police officers already targeting black people, predominantly young men, then had those actions greenlit by the state with the introduction of cess laws. Many young Rastas just trying to live were not supported by their parents because they did not subscribe to many of those more conservative Christian values, opposite to the media images of well-groomed, respectable youngsters stepping off ships dressed to the nines, not knowing what awaited them in England, now both a symbol of Britishness by institutions like the NHS and also concurrently a symbol of otherness through now the Home Office scandal as well. MFM did not subscribe to their parents' values, but were a productive force in our local community and wider, making connections with others who had similar problems. There was a magazine, there was fashion shows, there was arts and crafts, film exhibitions, sports teams, African dancing workshops, Rasta education, sound system, Caribbean dances and more. The MFM Facebook group is also an archive of memories, including the many women talking about the good old days. I also interviewed many white people who remember going to MFM. It became a point of engagement for many young people and a hub for any young person who wanted in. It was aimed at black youth, but it was inclusive of everyone. I remember my family friend Garfield, who came here from Nevis as a kid, telling me enough white people went to MFM. And it was MFM that he got interested in fitness, making his career as a fitness guru in Northamptonshire. Somewhere between the Caribbean and Northampton, Matta Fancanta became a hub for not only people in the UK, but many artists from Jamaica who came here to perform reggae music. Dennis Brown, Gregory Isaacs, Lorna G, Maxie Priest, Freddie McGregor, Frankie Paul, and Barris Hammond are a few who came to perform here. MFM had arrived with a splash where young black people had researched squatters' rights and then squatted a building, as I said earlier. MFM became a huge major venue for sound system culture in not only Northampton, but also the Midlands. Tonic suits, Cecil G's, dreads, flares, tank tops, fancy jumbo collared shirts, and platform shoes were fashion, giving local youth avenues to express themselves verbally, spiritually, aesthetically, where two tones had given way to Rasta and red, gold, and green. But by the end of the 70s, it was possible to see more and more black youth congregating in the racecourse park on the edge of town as well. People were talking, and there was a pilgrimage to belonging, a Caribbean black cultural oasis that some white youths also took part in too. A Caribbean front room out in provincial England. No one knew each other's names. It would have been nicknames or other names like Psyche, Baggy, like Cranstons, like Bones, like Afro Bill, like Flatnose Lenny, like Londoner, and the list goes on. And that prior summer of 76, before the squat, was a hot one, where the reggae music of the time made an indelible impact on how young Northamptonians saw themselves. They chatted nonsense, copied their teachers, mocked the establishment, their parents, the police, and made genuine human connections, united by roots reggae, the Dove of King Tubby, Lee Perry, and the Upsetters. They danced to Delroy Wilson, Cornell Campbell, Big Hugh, Dillinger, Iroy, Jacob Miller, Gregory Isaac, Dennis Brown, U-Roy, John Holt, and the Mighty Diamonds, Peptones. So this new generation were doing their best to hold on to their heritage. As summer evenings turned into autumn in the late 70s, Steps, as I said earlier, was a place for youngsters to go, dance, play, and chat, a place for upcoming sounds to do battle. Most of us are exposed to various sites of historical production, and with London, with London and other major cities positioned as by the media at the front of all knowledge making, we are being, I guess, scammed into thinking there were no sites like this elsewhere. For me, especially films like Babylon show that sound wasn't exclusive to the city, as I've said earlier, with Count Shelley being a Northampton sound. In 77, Matta Fancanta arrived in the unsuspecting industrial Midlands town and took the establishment and local black groups by force or by surprise. Filled with the entertainment and professional development opportunities black youth, upset the, I guess, the niceties of the elder generation as well. That night in 77, 7 or 8 youngsters went to the old Salvation Army Citadel on Sheep Street, kicked off the door and boarded it up and waited for the police to arrive, ready to do battle. People like Lee returned from Africa with a renewed sense of education and saw many black people schooled in this country doubt their own abilities and due to institutional racism. Organisations that wanted to do things were enabled by other bodies like the council who could just as easily disable you as well. In the beginning, these black guys were motivated by non-material things like community, and you cannot put a price on that. By 84, the MFM was a respected organisation. However, its downfall also came from the inside. MFM arrived with a bang and showed others that would try to threaten Northampton that nobody could take Northampton because it was protected. But their first loss came due to drug and gun dealers who did not care about the necessary youth and community work that was being done. They were in it for themselves, self-interest, personal gain, and really selfish reasons. They were about capitalising on the weak-mindedness of some people in Northampton as movement was infiltrated later by the police, black officers from the north of England, who would smoke with the guys and date local women and really immerse themselves within our community. So it's very easy to say that racism was the only reason, considering how movement started, but we must also think of the role of other black people and the flawed characters that exist in this wide-reaching and diverse human experience. This was compounded by notably the misappropriation of funds as well, where money was reportedly that was meant to be used for reinvestment into MFM was spent elsewhere, including on houses. We know white folks do the same thing, but grassroots community Black organisations are still scrutinised when it comes to allocation of funding in Northampton and wider afield. Local funding bodies are still more hesitant to fund us to do stuff. Yet, thinking about the story of MFM, that is a nuanced history in many shades of grey that doesn't fit so nicely on those famous blue plaques. How Black history are told in media doesn't really allow space for nuances of the ifs or the buts and the maybes and the questions and the human choices Black people, but also people in general make in those days out of survival, or in some cases, selfishness, where mass media are set in making monuments out of people, which I explore further in the article I did for Race Reflections. Whilst the film and TV space has told stories of our elders who arrived by ship and by plane, I also wanted to see stories about the shades of grey that existed and the decisions made based on survival, not convenient storytelling as well. Misappropriation of funds is the tip of the iceberg. During my interviews, I was also told of people that arrived as stowaways as well on ships. MFM also has a story, reports of an alleged dodgy alcohol license. Police were set on getting MFM with anything. There was a court case. There was no dodgy license in the end. It was all a fix-up. MFM led to scandal in 1990 when it was found Black officers undercover had infiltrated, which led to the arrest of one individual selling sawn-off shotguns, with those business meetings being held at the club. A big drug dealing ring was reportedly broken up at the club in '91. Yet what started as a brilliant effort to mobilise young people turned into one of individuals succumbing to base human desires of greed and selfishness. From that early squat, the local establishment wanted MFM to fall or fail, and were just looking for reasons to do it. The Windrush elders too did not like MFM either, in large. Of course, it wasn't every single one, but it was enough for my participants to tell me about it. And it seems to me that both got their wish when in January 1995, bulldozers were sent in to demolish this hub of the young Black community, literally in the middle of the night, I was told. This photo was taken in 2004 by Northampton photographer James Smith, and it was part of a project called Absent Status. He captioned this plot, a redundant wasteland that is now used as a cut-through, used to house the former Matta Fancanta movement, Can Guide Yourself, the first Black self-help centre in the country. Between 75 and 85, the town once had a thriving Black community, of which the MFM Centre played a significant role. At the beginning, a leading community figure such as Trevor Hall, aka Ras Jubilani, helped run the centre, giving guidance and guiding yourself against self-destruction. Not only was the former Salvation Army Citadel a listed building, it was a workshop in skilled trades and a significant national tour date for international reggae and hip-hop artists. The building was demolished with its entire contents literally overnight. Stuart Hall has also talked about alternative spaces for finding truth and knowledge. The corroborations of such stories like this have not come from the halls of academia or the official spaces, but local venues in my community, including the Lab on Charles Street, Northampton. Even at its end, the powers that be, Babylon, I believe, were scared of an uprising and sent those bulldozers in the night to do the work. These sorts of photos show us how living Blackness exists in the wake. To parrot Christina Sharp, in the aftermath of enslavement, out in provincial England, this is what whiteness can do to us, making us into ghosts, claiming we don't have a history, and then having numbers of us having to prove that we do. MFM is a story that does not fit so nicely on the blue plaque, and is also a great example of flawed humans as history makers. There are other examples of upsetting the usual post-war Caribbean British history. Also means acknowledging that a good many of who came in that era of the 50s and 60s were stowaways. And I found as much on my PhD interviews as well. There will be stories of underground criminality, abuse, violence, not only from white folks to Black Caribbean people, but also what Caribbean people did to each other when they got here. Anti-Leicester prejudice is also something that has not been addressed properly, no less than in media representations of post-war Black Britain. Those who live in glass houses probably shouldn't throw stones, but we never hear these stories as it inconveniences this picture that we've had in media of good immigrants who came to build back.
Trey, I'm just politely interrupting you to ask you to wrap up.
Yeah, I'm nearly finished.
Wonderful.
If we talked about histories of post-war Britain that go beyond the usual film and TV depictions, what about, I suppose, of mixed Caribbean English and also Irish families? One of my interviewees, Barbara Nelson, grew up in Northampton as a child of a white woman and a Jamaican man, and she grew up in the 50s and 60s and discussed the freedom of the fields around Northampton. She doesn't remember racism herself, but remembers her mother facing some of the most horrific abuse when she chose to have children with a Black man as well. Barbara also went to movement in those days, and it was a great place to meet others. Many of those who went to MFM, born in this country, also identified more with the Caribbean and the African continent than Britain. Terms like Black British were generally not things they identified with. As Paul Gilroy said, that it ain't where you're from, it's where you're at. This paper was based on original interviews that were part of a broader PhD project about Caribbean Northants. It was also partially influenced and based on a talk my cousin Weeks did last November. His artwork was also in the main building of MFM. The things they did when they were 17, 18, 19, and 20-something years old. I find it quite inspiring in spite of what that happened. Pedro Samuel, Ira Moven, Barbara Nelson, June Elizabeth, White, Smith Gully, Trevor Hall, Horace and Michael Cohen, and the late Lee Bryan, among others, are part of a collective who were changed by their experiences. But the numbers of white people who positively benefited from their engagement with the Black community, and the children who were in the late 80s, 90s that went with their parents. People like Don Allen, otherwise known as Psyche, it was MFM that started his career in youth work. Weeks did much of the artwork there, and later going on to found Spears Youth Theatre Company in '85, a Black youth theatre company. MFM was starting for many like youth work, the arts, sports and fitness, and really being well-rounded human beings. And also offers an alternative space of Blackness, a narrative in Britain that has been eclipsed by the cities. Its ending does not take away the work they did, no less than how reggae culture exposed many to a different type of education, with its constant references to Africa, elevating youth consciousness. I think I'd want to end about the legacy of MFM and how we've seen where there are numerous practitioners and activists and artists in Northampton doing really amazing work. But those, especially those of Caribbean heritage and the white folks who grew up in the culture. This is the legacy of MFM. I couldn't fit them all on one slide. Also to include people like Jacob Brethwaite, Hark Hugh, Ivor Johnson Band, also Lou Angel. Lou's dad was Phil, who ran the electronics, and his son, Chris Bass, runs the sound system, Ital Lion, which Lee actually talked about in my interview with him. Mystic Crew was founded in 1988, and they practiced in MFM's basement, and also the founding of Jar Trooper Sound as well in '98. Narissa Simone, Christopher Morrison, Afrini, and other Black and Black mixed artists probably wouldn't be able to play in the way they do today if MFM and bands like Mystic Crew hadn't done the work and broken down those doors previously, which also made it easy for me as a poet and as a spoken word artist too. I think as well, I owe my poetry career in Northampton to movement, even though I didn't know it until recently. Local activist, entrepreneur, and curator Shireen Ingram, further to Ashley Mackenzie and team at Restoration Sound in the legacy of MFM and Count Shelley. Numbers to stop striving for something more, to be part of things bigger than themselves. At Movement, it wasn't really about winning against the system, but showing what was possible. While I know I haven't covered everything in this talk, I truly hope it has been done some justice to this organisation and taken that citadel in '77. It really became a metaphor for the good and the dangerous times that defined many Northamptonians of their generation. And thanks very much for listening. I think if anyone's got questions, we're doing a Q&A now. So yeah, thanks very much. And thanks Eve for hosting this as well.
Can we just give Trey a virtual round of or literally a round of applause? Thanks so much. That was brilliant. That was fantastic. Yeah, Trey, I don't know if you noticed as you were speaking, but so many comments came in to the chat, so numerous that I won't be able to read them out. But just to yeah, please have a look at those because there's so many words of encouragement. Everybody's saying brilliant presentation, fascinating. Thank you for all your hard work. Yeah, wonderful. So just to remind everyone that this session is being recorded. So if you would like to ask an anonymous question, you can put that in the chat. Otherwise, please do switch on. If you have a question, please put your hand up and switch your camera on, and I'll try and come to as many of you as possible because I'm sure a lot of us have a lot of questions. So does somebody want to start? Has anybody got a question they want to put to Trey? It's gone quiet. I see that there's one. I see Gillian put one in the chat. So, okay, Gillian, why don't we start with you, and then if anybody wants to think of a question in the meantime, then we'll keep it going. Thank you.
Hi, Trey. Great presentation. I don't know how you fitted so much data into this short space. So good job. Yeah, I wanted because you mentioned about I think it was Maureen, some of the people in the MFM movement who worked with the Saturday schools. I just wanted to know, how did you find out about the stuff the schools linking with the movement?
It came, well, the MFM stuff came up within broader interviews about the Caribbean Northamptonshire, but Saturday school stuff came from Morcia in the beginning. I'm just telling you about this for years since I was a kid. So I also went to my mum and my godmum ran Saturday school in Northampton in the mid-noughties. But Morcia has known my family since I was a young child. So I've grown up hearing those stories. And then it was through Morcia that I met Sarah Berry. But there was actually an ITV news broadcast from 1977 where I first saw Sarah Berry. And I was been asking everyone I could talk to, how can I find Sarah Berry, basically. And then eventually I did interview Sarah, and she told me about Saturday schools as well, and the West Indian Parents Association. But also prior research was done by the Northamptonshire Black History Association. 2008 book Sharing the Past has a couple of chapters, I think, about post-war Caribbean people in Northamptonshire, and it does talk about the Saturday schools. I think they did. One of the things I didn't get to talk about that organisation as well, which deserves its own talk and space, was that after the Brixton Uprising in '81, they got funding to do how would you call it, supplementary like fun days and stuff like that. And it was things that they did for all children, not just Black children. So it was run by Black people, but they were serving the entire like spectrum of youth experiences when they ran those. And they ran those out of the Northampton School for Boys playing fields as well. So it was mainly sports activities and things like that. So that's how I got to know about Saturday schools. My mum and my godmum ran one in the mid-noughties, but they themselves come out of this, I guess, this genealogy of people who had done the work prior in the 90s, the 80s, and the 70s, like Morcia, but also the guys that ran ACES, which was African Caribbean Elders Society as well, which in itself came out of West Indian Parents. So yeah, there's quite a few organisations around Northampton and in Wellingborough as well that were feeding off each other at that time. And Mike Prescott and Billy Walker and Merlin Francique in Wellingborough were doing a lot of the stuff on Saturday schools in the Wellingborough community. And a lot of that stuff started in people's houses, but then it went to Harriet's Lane, which was the original site of what we now call WACA. So the Wellingborough African Caribbean Association is now on Rock Street, but it started at Harriet's Lane. But yeah, those early Caribbean elders did a lot of the activist work in education. And yeah, Wellingborough has its own story, Northampton has its own story, and there's a lot of crossover as well. I interviewed Paul Croft as well. He's still around, and he told me a lot of stuff about Wellingborough schools and how they were very they didn't want to talk about racism and things like that in those days. And there's a lot of Black children in schools in Wellingborough who were being treated unfairly in very, very racist ways. So Wellingborough has its own story. Northampton has its own story. There is crossover, and also going out to Kettering as well has its own history too of racism. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question, and I've not rambled too much.
No, it was perfect. Thank you. Cheers.
Great. Has anyone else got a question they want to put to Trey? I've been scribbling down. I can see Heather Paul's got her hand up. I'll just unmute you. Just 1 second.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I think we're good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
You can hear me. Good evening. Hi, Trey.
Right.
You're absolutely fabulous. Thank you for the presentation. I had, I guess, basically was blessed to work in Northampton, late 80s to early 90s as community development officer under the umbrella organisation in terms of all the organisations you spoke about, NCACO. And I think for me, one of the strengths of all those organisations, I mean, they had their own unique issues, but they came together. And I think learning in terms of how organisations can collaborate, despite having their own philosophies and priorities, they did support each other across the piece in terms of bringing together the issues. The various chairs of the organisations, the fundraising, that NCACO guests was there to kind of have that bridge. And in terms of the resistance against the police, that was one of the main things that we were involved in, but also all the educational issues in terms of Marcia and others leading that. And for me, I think that was a strength that I saw come in there, because it was the cradle to the grave when you put all the organisations together. Nursery provision, at Clare Street, and all the funding around that, and after school things, and like you say, the mental health projects, WIPA, in terms of older people and so on. So for me, it's, time changes things, but I think the learning from the positivity that was around at that time and how it galvanized people to, I guess, respect each other's priorities, but then move forward and tackle the local authority, the borough council, as well as the other institutions, was so important. I thank you for bringing that history, obviously, to the fore, and making, I guess, the people who put together the work on the ground, and now the batons hopefully are being handed down, and there's some progression on some of those issues. I'm looking forward to reading your PhD. Great, thank you.
Thanks, Helen.
Trey, so I might take Chair's privilege just quickly. So I'm really interested in, I mean, the amount of interviews that you've done for this project, it's just so ambitious, but also really, really impressive. But the question I have really is the time period, because you're looking at 1948 to 1985. So my question there would be, I don't know if I stepped out for 5 minutes, so I'm hoping I didn't miss it, but about the the invasion of Grenada, right? Because you're talking about a strong community contingent that went to Northampton. And so that's like the thing that's kind of ringing in my ears is, was there a push factor? What kind of solidarity and kind of political movements, and was that did that kind of integrate into then all the things that were happening on the ground in Northampton? Was that part of a bigger picture basically of solidarity efforts and community?
In specifics to the, I'm thinking you're referring to the coup in '79, and I'm not sure actually what the response was from local people in community.
I'm asking about the US invasion. I just think that would really be so powerful. I think
that's something that if I do find out, it'll be covered when I go and visit the records office, where all the stuff around the organisations that Heather was talking about are, so records and documents and stuff like that. But what I can tell you is that my grandmother was in Grenada during that time. She went there on a visit, and she had to be carried out of Grenada on a military plane. And whenever she tells that story, it's very animated and exciting, and she makes it into a bit of an adventure, but it's also quite serious as well. Yeah, so that history as well is quite
Yeah,
quite prominent. And in my own in the autoethnographic elements as well, I think it'll be a disservice if I don't say that my mum went to Grenada at that time, and she met Maurice Bishop, and she was on a radio program about it. So yeah, there's quite a lot of history, autoethnographic elements that I probably could include, in the sense that if you were Grenadian in the 70s, it would be impossible for you to not know about that America had invaded Grenada, a country of what was then about 90,000 people, probably. Yes, it was part of that whole grift in like the left-wing tradition in the Caribbean, because you had similar things going on prior in Cuba at that time, and for Grenada to follow in that footsteps, you always had the Rodney riots in Jamaica. I think it was 1967 as well, in response to the academic Walter Rodney, who was educating people in Jamaica's working class poor communities about their rights as Black people and things like that. So you had this tradition, and it goes back to the 30s with C.L.R. James and this whole tradition of left-wing Caribbean intellectuals and activists. So to bring that into Northampton, I think MFM sort of was the Northampton iteration of that. But I think they'd gone further than left, and I think that's why they upset a lot of people, is that they were more radical than the traditional activist groups.
Okay, yeah. So just to underline, then, I think what I was trying to say was that these events are interconnected, right? And these traumas are kind of lived and then reproduced. So that is an essential part of your research, really, to think about that question. And I think it's really powerful. Research in itself, but yeah, looking to that and the kind of historical earthquakes that were happening right around the same time are also really fascinating. I can see April's got her hand up. I'm very sorry that we're talking too much. Do you have a question?
Hi, can you hear me? I've got these earphones in. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
really well.
Yeah, you can. Okay, brilliant. It was in response to Leicester, who put a comment, asked a question around the research. How do you see your research informing current community activism and practice? And someone has responded, I think Jack's responded to that your research has influenced. But I think this is such an important piece of work, and you have actually awakened the consciousness, I think, of the fabric of Northamptonshire, especially around the Caribbean communities, where we have, I think, lost some essence and some soul within our community today. It's such a different place to what it was in the 70s and in the 80s and even in the 90s. So it's super brilliant that you're doing this in order to encourage conversations and to really endorse and support that our contributions to British society in Northamptonshire is really immense. It just, when you're looking at all the things that you've documented today, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, our cultural influence is great. And it does sadden me. I feel emotional that it has been trodden on, actually, and minimized to the point where there isn't that sense of pride in our history. Do you see what I mean? So, and it's still happening today. Northamptonshire is one of those places that it's just a strange place. But what I'm seeing now is people like yourself, individuals like yourself, and I will say the younger generation, are actually setting those boundaries and standing firm around truth of what our history is, and also embedding the positive cultural aspects of our lives in their lives today. You know, or when we talk about the music influence, the food influence, the cultural influence around music and celebrations, we are definitely resurrecting that in Northamptonshire and being proud of that. And I'm just super proud of what you're doing here and the impact it's having on so many of us elders in the community, and the fact that, yes, the nostalgia has been great. And, I used to sneak into the MFM and stuff like that. And Mummy Kathy used to park her car there because she worked at Barclaycard. There's a whole plethora of stories one can tell. And even around the prejudice amongst ourselves as a people, around the Rastafarian movement and traditions and cultures and what have you. So thanks very much, Trey. And yeah, I can't wait to read it. I don't know if I will, but I can't wait to read it. I'll read it in bits. Thank you.
Okay, do you want to respond to any of that, or shall I move to the next question?
Yeah, I think, well, April's my mum as well. So yeah, I think mum's right about also what she said. I'd also like to say as well that a lot of the things that my grandparents' generation fought for in Northampton and Wellingborough especially, all those things, the buildings have gone as well predominantly. They've been demolished, or other communities have taken over. So it's quite interesting when we get Black Caribbean students coming from North and South London to Northampton, and there's a lot of them study here, and they ask where are all the Caribbean restaurants and stuff? Where's the community organisations? And you have to tell them that it's been systematically erased through whiteness, effectively. And that's a whole conversation in of itself about spaces and places and what spaces get built and who they belong to, and even things like being built now. So yeah, and that's all I'm gonna say on that one, because I know Lace has got a hand up and Marcia's got a hand up as well. So
yeah, I'm going to go to Marcia next, please. Are you still there? You are on mute, Marcia.
Okay, it's just a statement really, because for me, there's been certain reassurances about the elder community with the work that Trey's been doing. And more than once he said how useful it is to be able to collect information. So it just shows that group of us who are older didn't discard the history that we were going through at that period. And so it gives him, and then he can build on it. But what's been joyful, and I say this unreservedly, is the joy it has given me in my learning to sort of shadowed Trey. I think a couple of times April has said, I don't know why you're driving him all the way over there, Why are you taking him? You can get the bus. And if only she'd realised that the journey, that if I was driving, the conversations for me has certainly lightened my years. So I thank him for that. I thank his mother for sharing it with me, because I can be grandma. Because in the learning and the work that Trey's doing, it is important, and he's realised it, to remember that past that was there, because that is what he's actually building on to go into the future. And as I say, it has been an absolute pleasure for me to be learning from him. Every time I sit down and take breath, there's a learning thing for me. So it's not just Trey, the giving and saying, here you are. There's learning, and it only happens if you're willing to open your minds to it. So Trey, I hope you've enjoyed time spent. There's still, I had to send you a late email last night saying you gave me a bit of a job. I haven't achieved it yet, but I'm going to. That kind of effort, that it gives me the energy to carry on. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we go to our next question or comment, please. Dr. Jackson.
Thank you. I think that's me. Really, I just wanted to say, just a statement, Trey, absolutely fantastic research. I mean, when I spoke to you and then now to find out just how much interviews you've been able to do in really a short space of time, I just think it's phenomenal. And just the information and data coming out of it, I'm really, really, it's just so exciting. I can't wait actually to hear about the Wellingborough branch of it because I'm from Wellingborough. And so just in terms of some of the things that you've already started to speak about in terms of, you know, the older community, in terms of the Rastafarianism being against that. And I think in terms of Wellingborough, the kind of the Christian versus the kind of, you know, West Indian or Caribbean culture in Waka, and that was something that I'm hoping is going to come out of you know, your further research. And just a nod to April, hi, because we used to go to college together. It's just really just seeing faces from the past. I think it's such a legacy. And so my question was about not necessarily what I know you're going to do with it, but how can we as a community get involved to make sure that this absolutely gets spread and disseminated, because it is such a pivotal piece of work. So yeah, thank you for inviting me. I've really, really enjoyed this session.
Oh, thanks, Lace. Yeah, last year was quite a long and hard year for me when it came to interviews. So 120 approximately in 8 months. Some were 20 minutes, so it wasn't so bad. But others who had a lot more to say. So I think the longest interview was 2 hours. And people were talking about Northampton in the 50s and the 60s as well, and what was going on locally in that period. So how am I going to disseminate information? I think just more events like this, but I think I want to do more in-person events as well. So people would know venues that would be up for stuff like this happening in person, not just around MFM, but also things around, well, I've got findings on pretty much everything that happened in London, the big cities, happened in some form or some way in Northampton context, from employment to sports, to the issues of racism, to activism organisations, to things like the issues of like doubled identities of being hybrid, of being British and Caribbean, and straddling that hyphenated identity as well. So yeah, if people, in terms of help, like help me find places that would be up for doing events like this in person, whether that's in Northamptonshire or elsewhere, just anywhere. If anyone knows places that would be interested in stuff like this, get them to contact me. But also, the interview process is now completed. But I'm always interested in people's memories of events and things like that happen locally. So if anyone knows anybody that wasn't interviewed but wants to share things, they still can with me if they want to as well. So especially people from Wellingborough as well, because I know in terms of the interviews, there's a huge waiting from Northampton and Wellingborough. I interviewed a lot of people from Wellingborough, but not nearly as many as I did in Northampton. So I think I need people who were in Wellingborough in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. If they want to share, tell them to send me a message and whatever. Yeah, thanks, Lace.
We've also had 2 messages in the chat, one saying that somebody is dialed in from Qatar and somebody else from Japan, which I think is really testament to your to the reach and just the impact that this research is having already. I just think it's just completely admirable. Has anybody else got a question for Trey?
I think, Mona, you had something to say, didn't you?
Brilliant.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't have my screen set. It's the first time I've used Zoom. Apologies, but I've sussed it out now. I just wanted to say I'm one of those Rastafarians. I'm Trey's great aunt, and I went through the MFM, the West Indian Club. It was a place that I must admit, Northamptonshire in the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s, we did have a really good Caribbean community and sense of worth, and we had things going for us, and I used to have locks. It prevented me from getting work, my parents did understand, but I can resonate with what went on. And I left Northampton because of a lot of different changes and the racism that I was going through in Northampton. And I left Northampton, I went to live in London in the spring of 1978. If I didn't leave Northampton, I don't know what would have happened to me, because I was a person, I would stand up and speak up for myself. And because of the discrimination of the police and seeing my brothers being chased by skinheads from the parks, the race course at Abington Park, running for their lives, all that traumatized me as a youngster growing up. And I felt I couldn't stay in Northampton anymore. I went to London, and I spent 10 years in London. And in those 10 years, it was so diverse. I felt warmth. And in those 10 years, I only faced racism, I think it was twice, one in the workplace and one by a driver. And I was able to feel more myself. I had my locks, I was accepted. I used to be a youth and community worker. I worked in communities in Peckham, Whitechapel, and I came back to Northampton in 1992, and it changed. The spirit, the Caribbean spirit just seemed to have gone, the unity and the community. And then seeing MFM gone, the West Indian Club gone, Steps gone. We used to go to roller skating in King's Heath, where it was called Hereward Wakehouse. We all would go to roller skating there and stuff. All that had gone, and it just seemed like we lost it all, and we fought so hard to get that community vibes, Caribbean community vibes, and it had all gone. And to this day, it's just, and I look at I'm glad Trey's doing this. I mean, I played a big part in the research and some of the photos, but I'm so glad that my great nephew has brought this back to life, and to get people thinking and to respect what my parents went through when they came here. I came here when I was 1.5, a baby, and I still had to pay for my citizenship when Mrs. Thatcher told us, brought in this new law, and I came here on a British passport, okay? So it's just glad that Trey's bringing this back. The young people need to know what my parents went through as Windrush, what I went through as a baby, in the school, in education, in the workplace. They need to know how we fought to get to where we are now. And you young people of all colours, diversity, you have to realise there's history, right? There's good history and there's bad history, but you determine, society can determine what kind of history we want to live in and bring forward. And what we need now is more unity and respect for one another's culture, religion, whatever, don't matter. Live and let live, and let's just all come together as one. And I just want people to know that, remember what your parents went through, remember what your foreparents went through, and remember what chances you have now in life, right, to carry on that journey in a positive manner. Sorry, I get carried away. So yeah.
It's brilliant. This is absolutely brilliant. Trey, I'm just thinking as we're wrapping up the session, I did say to Trey that if anybody wants to have an informal chat with Trey at the end of the session, what we'll do is I'll hand over hosting privileges to him, and anyone who wants to stay around can just have just have a catch up with him, and we can extend the session as long as you want, but we will be wrapping up in a few minutes. The question I had for you, Trey, was about this is a creative writing PhD. It's a piece of work that you're reading a wealth of literature and trying to think about how you're going to put these stories right into some kind of narrative. Have you thought about how are you going to do that? Are you going to have them speak to each other? Have you been reading other books, for example, that use oral histories? Have you been what's next with this wealth of material? Because yeah, it's just thinking about what is it going to be a creative writing story basically inspired by the stories that you've heard, or are you literally going to bring these voices and these stories to life on the page, if that makes sense?
I think with this project, I'm trying to detract away from even though I'm doing biography, I'm going to treat Northampton and Wellingborough as the character rather than the individual people that I interviewed in that sense. Well, if you look at books that write about place, for example, these cities and these towns are main characters in of themselves. You used to look at books about Brixton, for example, during the 1960s. Brixton is also a character as well as the actual individual humans themselves. And I think for Northampton and Wellingborough, it's about treating them as the characters. I will name individuals, the ones that give me permission to name them and stuff in the PhD. I will be focusing on I'll be streamlining quite a number of the stories that I've been told about different things into creating a broader narrative about these places, and really just to show people that Northampton and Wellingborough have had Caribbean people here as long as London in the post-war sense. But also, what I also wanted to do is also show people what were people doing in the Caribbean before they came here as well. And one of my big interests, as you know, is Black people and the countryside and the rural history. And one of the things I've written 2 chapters already. So the first chapter after the introduction is about what people that came from the rural areas of the Caribbean were doing in the Caribbean, and then they came here and were thrust into factories that was completely different to what they were used to do in the Caribbean. So my family were in farming, for example, and then Grandma Tiley and Edison came over from Grenada and worked in factories. And I know Grandad Edison worked at a place called Phipps Brewery in Northampton for a bit as well. Great Grandma Tiley worked, I know she was a cleaner in, I think it was St. Crispin's Hospital as well. And they'd gone from one type of living style in the Caribbean to coming to England and doing something completely different. And similarly, the guys that came from the rural Caribbean and were thrust into London, into big cities, mega cities, and how disorientating that must have been for them as well. So I think there's that whole story of the countryside that's been lost, both in the Caribbean, but also in this country as well. And as I've seen recently with the news headlines about Black people not being allowed access to the countryside and things like that. I think that's also about history as well. Historically speaking, Black people have been in the countryside in England for centuries. We know that, but because of how the story's been told about the countryside, it's been written as white only in people's heads, I think, a little bit. And that's what I'm trying to get people to think differently about. Is that we've always been here, and there's evidence to that effect as well. So yeah, in terms of my PhD, it's about treating Northampton and Wellingborough as the character, and people simply just came here and lived here. And you come to Northampton now and you talk to people, everyone has a different story about Northampton. Everyone has a different story about Wellingborough. And Alan Moore famously said that Northampton is the centre of the universe, and he's absolutely correct. I think. So yeah. So I think hopefully that answered some of your question, Eve, in terms of where I'm going with this.
Yeah, Trey, this is just exceptional. Your work's outstanding. And I think everybody here today just absolutely got so much out of it. And I think what's most commendable about what you're doing is this counter narrative. It's this pushback that you're doing and saying, I'm not going to have a London-centric focus, and this is how I'm doing it, and this is how I'm centering it. and you can just see that the positive benefits, right, that's having already across, you know, people who are getting involved in the study, people who are interested or participating in interviews. It's just a really beautiful project that you are creating, and it's something that also you are, you know, being driven by and influenced and inspired by as well. I just there's so much to say. So I'm very sad that we will have to close the session now. So I am going to, before I stop recording, could we all just thank Trey by either putting on your emojis or virtually clapping, please, virtual round of applause, and just thank you so much.